This section of the class introduces you to the structure and function of cells and their components. Cells are the smallest and simplest living things. They're bounded by a membrane which separates the living organism from the external environment. Individual cells like bacteria can exist alone. Many cells are part of larger, more complex organisms like plants and animals. Each cell is somewhat independent as it can live separate from other cells given the right conditions of temperature, moisture, nutrients. Cells replicate and make new cells. This is one of the characteristics of all living organisms. This is a visual representation of a plant cell with all of its component parts. They're called organelles. Notice the central vacuole is the largest organelle. A cell must have a membrane, and each one of the parts or component organelles are critical to its function. We're going to learn about each one of these this lesson. Robert Hooke developed the theory that all living organisms are composed of individual cells. This was a revolutionary idea in the 17th century. He observed mostly dead cells of cork that came from the bark of a cork oak. The word cell did not come from the idea of a jail cell, but rather from the word cellula, which is a small room of a monk. The idea that cells produce other cells was also revolutionary during Hooke's era. There are two basic kinds of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. The simplest is called prokaryotic, and it's represented by a bacteria. These cells have a membrane but no specialized organelles within. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, are a later invention of Mother Nature, since they are more complex and more likely developed from the merger of prokaryotic organisms. The prokaryotes have no separate organelles. The eukaryotes have specialized organelles bounded by their own membranes. Notice the difference between the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. The older organisms, the prokaryotes, emerged about 3.5 billion years ago. Eukaryotes are much younger. Prokaryotes are smaller and have no organelles, unlike the eukaryotes which have specialized organelles within. Plant and animal cells have much the same sorts of organelles, but plants have three types of organelles that animal cells do not. Animal cells don't have cell walls, which makes them more mobile than plants. They don't have vacuoles to store water, and they don't have chloroplasts, the organelle that captures sunlight and makes the plant green. The cell wall that provides rigidity to the plant cell is made up of cellulose, or a long carbon compound. The cell wall keeps the plants erect. Cell walls may have two or more layers and may vary in thickness depending on their role in the plant. The outer barrier of the cell is called a cell wall. It's made up of cellulose, long carbon compounds, and the cell wall is not alive, it's actually dead. Water can pass through easily, and there's spaces between the cell walls. If we look at the components of a cell wall, we find the initial cell wall of the young cell is called the primary cell wall. It's thin and less rigid than the secondary cell wall, which develops as a plant cell matures. This allows the young stems of trees, for example, to be more flexible than the older branches. The secondary wall material is deposited inside the primary wall material over time. And between the cells is a glue-like substance that holds the cells together, lets them stick together. This region is called the middle lamella. Just inside the cell wall, we find the cell membrane. This is a living component of the cell, unlike the cell wall. It's composed of a lipid bilayer, that is, two layers of molecules, in which part is lipid or oil-like, and part is a phosphate compound, represented by the red balls in the picture. The lipid component of the molecule, the blue part, is hydrophobic, that is, it repels water. Remember, oil and water don't mix, right? The phosphorus head is attracted to water, on the other hand. Lipid has one hydrophilic, attracted to water, and one hydrophobic, repels water, end. The living contents of the cell are the cytoplasm and the organelles. The cytoplasm, or sometimes called cytosol, is a semi-fluid substance which forms most of the cell mass. It's about 70% water. The cytoplasm is delimited or bounded by the cell wall and by the cell membrane. The organelles inside the eukaryotic cell provide the functional components of the cell. Each has a very specific purpose, which we'll begin to look at now. There are actually quite a few plant cell organelles. The ones we're going to look at in this class are the nucleus, the mitochondria, the chloroplast, the lysosome, and the vacuole. Each has a particular function, which we'll learn about. Let's start with the nucleus, the so-called brains of the cell. The nucleus is the control center, and usually the most prominent structure of the cell, easiest to be seen. It has two major functions. First, it controls most of the activities of the cell by producing protein molecules, enzymes, which control other parts of the cell. Also, it stores genetic material in the form of chromosomes or DNA, which it passes on to daughter cells during cell division and replication. Inside the nucleus, we find chromosomes made of DNA. These will double and divide and produce two new cells from one, sharing the memory of the mother cell with the daughter cells. Two cells make four, four cells make eight, and on as plants grow. Let's now turn to the mitochondrion, the so-called powerhouse of the cell. A mitochondrion is an organelle that takes sugar that was created through the process of photosynthesis by another organelle, the chloroplast, and create a chemical form of energy that is useful to the plant and allows other organelles to do work. Sugar is converted to ATP, adenosine triphosphate, through the process of respiration in the mitochondrion. There may be 1 to 1,000 mitochondrion per cell, each having their own DNA. The DNA of the mitochondrion is actually different than the DNA of the nucleus. This is important as we try to understand where cells came from later on. Let's now turn to the chloroplast, the cellular organelle that makes plants look green. In plant cells, and not in animal cells, chloroplasts capture sunlight and make sugars from the raw materials of carbon dioxide and water. Chloroplasts are probably the most common organelle in plants, and each single leaf cell may contain as many as 40 to 50 chloroplasts. A single millimeter of leaf may contain 500,000 chloroplasts. Inside the chloroplasts is a compound, a pigment called chlorophyll, and through the process of photosynthesis, captures sunlight and makes sugar. Chlorophyll also makes the plants look green because chlorophyll absorbs red and blue wavelengths of light and reflects green light back into our eyes, which is what we see. The green color of plant leaves are due to lots of small little chloroplasts containing the compound, the pigment chlorophyll, inside the leaf cell. Through the process of metabolism, plant cells also produce toxic compounds and other waste products. These may be stored for a while in the vacuole, but eventually need to be processed. The processing of waste products happens in the lysosome, so the toxic compounds don't build up and kill the cell. The word lysosome is derived from the Greek word lysis, or break apart, and soma, or body. Lysosomes contain digestive enzymes and may be thought of as the garbage disposal or the recycling unit in the cell. Finally, we have the vacuole. This is the largest organelle in the cell. It's a large membrane sac that contains water and sugars and salts and proteins and citric acid and many pigments. The central vacuole helps keep the plants erect because when it's full of water, it pushes against the rigid cell wall and helps hold the cells up. About 90% of the plant is composed of water, and the vacuole is full of water. This allows leaves to remain turgid and upright. As water pushes against the cell wall when the leaves are full of water, it holds the leaves up. And when water is lost in the leaves begin to wilt. Notice how these leaves of a pepper plant are wilted. When plants can't get enough water and vacuoles are not full, the leaf wilts. This actually protects the plant for a short time from more water loss. The contents of the vacuole can make fruit taste really interesting. The acidic contents of the vacuole in lemons and limes create the tart flavor we're familiar with. Each organelle in the cell has a particular function, and they all interact with each other in amazing ways. This allows the plant to live and grow and develop. Do you ever wonder how a eukaryotic cell came to be? Each of these component parts are relatively unique, having specialized function, and they all interact with each other in amazing ways. How'd that happen? Where did this complex eukaryotic cell come from? Well, we think they came from a process of merger. Prokaryotic organisms like bacteria came together to cooperate to create more complex organisms. Pretty cool, huh? A theory has emerged about the development of the eukaryotic organism that suggests it came through the merger of simpler prokaryotic organisms. Scientists observed that chloroplasts and mitochondria are about the same size as a prokaryotic bacteria. They each have their own unique DNA, different from the nucleus, and they each divide similarly within the cell. This theory suggests that the more complex eukaryotic cells resulted from the merger or cooperation of individual prokaryotic cells that came together. This process is called symbiogenesis. So that's a plant cell, the simplest living thing, and yet pretty complex in itself. The next section of the class, we look at how cells function in leaves, stems, and roots. Let's move on.